or a picture of the book, I think get it both in hardback and in Kindle. And I guess the first thing for those that aren't familiar with the word Tov, explain that real quickly, because that's, of course, the Hebrew word for good. And really, in a sense, you're talking about the circle of Tov, right?
Yes. We are, the word Tov is one of the most common words used in the Old Testament. It is not commonly used in Christian vocabulary. We're a little bit nervous about saying someone is good or even pursuing the good. But this is a big word in the Old Testament. It shows up a lot in the New Testament. And I think the Bible begins as a book of Tov, saying that everything that God created was Tov. And when he was completely done, it was Ma'od Ta'ov. And that is, everything was very, very good.
Yes.
And so we look at culture as something that needs to be Tov. And we need more church cultures that are not toxic, but Tov.
And so, again, a whole section on forming and deforming a church culture. And then we'll talk about the Circle of Tov. And so 12 chapters, great material. We're going to cover it for the hour. But also, I suspect some of you have been part of toxic churches or abusive churches, and maybe you want to add your comments or ask a question a little bit later. We'll certainly encourage you to do so as well. The book really gets into all sorts of really important issues, about 230 pages, published by our good friends at Tyndale, and I think you will enjoy the conversation today in the sense that you will be appreciating the fact that we're talking about it. You may not enjoy some of the things we're actually going to get into, but let's talk about this fact that every church is a culture. And you make a very strong case, which, of course, we've talked about before with Andy Crouch, that in culture making, that culture is not synonymous with worldview. But when you talk about culture, what do you mean?
Well, David Brooks, who some of your listeners will know, said never underestimate the power of the environment you work in to gradually transform who you are. When you choose to work at a certain company, you are turning yourself into the sort of person who works in that company. This is a really important point for us, and it's important for us to realize that culture is like an agent. It's something that is alive and well in a group of people that influences the people to be like that culture. And churches that are just beautiful and full of goodness, full of Tov, can influence people to become good people and to be more Tov-like. But we've been around other churches and we've been around other groups where it just seems toxic and everybody's angry and everybody's mean and everybody's picking on others and gossiping, and that develops into a culture. So we are asking people to begin to think of their church as a culture rather than simply a collection of individual Christians who gather together on Sunday, and to ask the question of what kind of culture is involved in my church, and do I want to be a part of that culture? And if I do, how can I help shape it toward Tov?
Yeah, culture of Tov. Again, one of the things I love about your book is you have some great diagrams, so it's kind of hard to explain that on radio. That's a good reason to get the book. But let me use a disclaimer right off the bat, because since you do occasionally mention names of leaders and church pastors and others, there may be a tendency, Scott, for some to think, oh, well, this is set at the top with the leader. And, of course, let's, again, hold pastors accountable. But it is more than just the problem with the pastor. It can be other leaders, and it can be the congregation, too, can't it?
Oh, it can be, yes. I have some, because I teach at a seminary and I've been teaching for 40 years, Kerby, I know a lot of pastors. And I know some pastors who are really, really fine people. They're Tov. And they can get in churches and just be destroyed by the relational dynamics in that church, by the corrupt character of people in that church. And so, yes, but in a sense, you could say it starts at the top.
Sure.
But if you move into a church, and let's just say you're the third pastor or the 18th pastor in a church, that culture is probably already formed,
Yes.
and you're going to have to plug in. So it's not
Right.
something. It's not one way. But if you start a church, then yeah, the leadership group is going to shape it. But then the people begin to interact, and before long, it is the interaction of leaders with, let's say, the congregation, and out of the congregation come leaders, and out of those leaders, they influence the congregation, and before long, a culture develops that is the impact of the interaction of leaders and congregants.
That's right.
So there's no church, Kerby, I want to say there's no church that escapes the issue of a toxic culture simply by getting rid of a pastor.
That's right.
And we do mention names because this started, our interest in this started because of what was happening in Chicago with places like Willow Creek and Harvest Bible Chapel. But, the Southern Baptist churches have plenty of stories to relate. It's all over the world.
The list is very long. Let me take a break. We have a couple of these mandatory breaks along the way. Scot McKnight with us, just an incredibly gifted individual, and we are privileged to have him with us. But me might get something to write with, because when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the early warning signs of a toxic culture, and we'll give you just a couple, and maybe some of those will ring true with your own experience. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager had to admit that he had been wrong. All his life, he has said that the left's moral compass is broken. He has concluded that in order to have a broken compass, you need to have a moral compass to begin with, but the left doesn't have one. He doesn't mean that conclusion as an attack. It is merely an observation that the left doesn't really think in terms of good and evil. We assume that other people think that way because we think that way, but that is not how most of the people on the left perceive the world. He begins with Karl Marx. He divided the world by economic class, the worker and the owner. One group was exploiting the other group. Good and evil aren't really relevant when you're thinking in terms of class struggle. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, operated beyond good and evil. To the Marxists, there is no such thing as a universal good or universal evil. Those of us who perceive the world from a Judeo-Christian worldview see ethics as relevant to the moral standard, not the person or the social status. Dennis Prager then provides a number of examples. Race is more important than ethics, as illustrated by some who argue that looting stores during riots is nothing more than reparations. Another example of a leftist compass is power. Right and wrong are determined by class, rich versus poor, and race, black versus white, and power, strong versus weak. And we see other examples of leftist perspective concerning sex and sexual orientation. We see this playing out vividly when a police officer must confront a person of color. The cop is always wrong, and the perpetrator is always right, regardless of his previous actions or prior criminal record. The moral compass isn't broken. Actually, it doesn't exist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Scot McKnight, and again, professor at Northern Seminary and the co-author of this book. Laura Barringer also has written about this as well. And let's, if we can, Scott, maybe focus on some of the warning signs of a toxic culture, because I think this then connects up with some of our listeners. They might be sitting in a church saying, I see that. This is something I need to be thinking more about. And so that's one of the reasons you put it in the chapter, because we can be in the midst of a church culture and say, well, I guess that's just kind of how all churches function. But that's not true, is it?
That's very insightful. That's totally true. You know, recently we've talked to a few people, and people are saying that this book is helping people perceive what's going on in their church by giving words to their very own experience.
Yes.
And what we say two major warning signs of a toxic church culture, and they are narcissism, and the other one we call power through fear.
Mm-hmm.
Narcissism is an easy, nasty sticker to put on people you don't like, but it has to be understood for what it is. And the Mayo Clinic says it's a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration. They have troubled relationships and a lack of empathy for others. And we find this to be characteristic of toxic church cultures, is they are led by people who want admiration. And not only do they want admiration, they give approval to people who admire them and surround themselves with people who admire them. And before long, you have a pocket of admiration. We sometimes call this sycophants. Another word is they are flatterers. And this starts to build a culture where someone is seen as super important. I was in a context not too long ago where someone said that this was the greatest professor ever in the history of the church. And I thought to myself, okay, we're now better than Augustine. We're now better than Luther and Calvin and all these people who were just absolutely brilliant in the history of the church. And this person is someone who's not known to hardly anyone. But that professor had surrounded himself with people like that. And this is a characteristic of narcissists. Furthermore, they often have troubled relationships. If you don't get along, if you don't do what they want, they break you off. And one of the main leaders of churches that we know about used to say, if someone disagreed with him and created a problem for him, he would say, this is Chicago terms of the mafia, we're going to break his legs. And that's the sort of thing that we hear more and more, is that when someone disagrees, they attack them. Another thing that I think is very interesting, because Kerby, it is so un-Christian, is that narcissistic leaders have no empathy for others. Right. They don't care when they fire someone. They don't care when someone's spouse dies, or when they, a parent dies or a child is in trouble. They may pretend to have empathy, but deep inside, they have no empathy. This is contrary to one of the great descriptions of Jesus in the Gospels, is that he was filled with compassion. And I personally believe that this was visibly demonstrated in his face and even in tears. So one of the characteristics of a toxic culture, one of the early warning signs, is a narcissistic leaning pastor. A second one, and this builds, is they establish their power through fear.
Yes.
And people become afraid of them. And we need, as Christian leaders, to develop a mentality that we are followers of Jesus together. People are not following us, doing what we tell them, but we are simply one of the others. And I'm not denying the significance of leadership and giftedness. I just think that we have developed a mentality where people are seen as superior, and they take that to the point where their reputation matters so much that if anyone infringes upon that, they begin to intimidate them through fear. And they scare people. I often say to people who come to me and ask about this, are you afraid of your pastor? Fear is different than respect. You know, I respected John Stott when I knew him. I respected some of my professors and my pastors, but I was never afraid of these people. I've been around others where I thought if I say something wrong, they're going to try to get me fired, or they're going to try to write. That's a different game altogether. Respect can sometimes flow directly into fear, and when fear is operating, then we're not doing, isn't it John who says perfect love casts out fear? This is what we need. We need a loving culture where people are not afraid of one another and afraid of leaders, but they respect and they are given respect.
You know, one of the people you quote is Ron Enroth, and of course, he's one I was referring to earlier, that his book came out, and then some of my colleagues actually did whole weeks of radio programs on some of that, on spiritual abuse. But in his book, you have a very good quote about the fact that these individuals become kind of a spiritual autocrat, religious dictator, really attempts to compel subordination. And even the examples you use in your book, in most cases, it's a twofer. Oftentimes, they have both a narcissistic personality and they use power through fear. So, in some respects, it isn't like one or the other. In most cases, these really abusive churches, or what you call toxic churches, usually have the full complement, don't they?
And that's, I only briefly mentioned that they build on one another. That's what happens. Narcissistic leaders. And, we see them in the work world, and we see them in presidential offices. We see them in sports activities. Narcissistic leaders establish their leadership through power and fear. And they build a whole culture that is shaped by that. And as long as everybody loves them, as long as everybody admires them, everything seems to go swimmingly smooth. And we think, we've got a great church, we've got a great organization, and then one person spills the beans. One person opens a door and sees something that shouldn't be seen. One person pulls back the curtain, and then the rage, which is characteristic of narcissists, the rage explodes, and people start getting their knees cut out from under them, and people start getting accused falsely. Oh my! It is. These are horrible stories about the church, but they're present enough in the church that we need some categories, some labels, some analytics, so that we can recognize it in our own churches and start to work toward cultures of Tov.
Let's, if we can, take a break. And we've been working our way through the first section, which is forming and deforming a church culture. But I thought just before we move on to, again, how to create a goodness culture, I might at least pick out one other thing after the break, and that is Matthew 18. Because in Matthew 18, of course, that's how you address some of these issues of inappropriate behavior. But it really wasn't until, Scott, I read your book that I could see how people misuse and misapply Matthew 18, actually use it as a tool against individuals trying to provide some accountability. So I think that's at least one element I want to put on the table. Then we're going to talk about, okay, can we create churches that nurture empathy and nurture grace and make a people-first culture and nurture truth and justice and service and Christ-likeness? I think we can. So we've certainly provided a diagnosis, and now we also want to talk about a prescription. But if you find yourself saying, okay, say, I need to get this book. It is coming out next week. It is Church Called Tov, and it is forming a goodness culture that resists abuse of power and promotes healing. Scot McKnight with us as we talk about this, that he has co-authored the book. It is published by Tyndale, and you should be looking for it in your local bookstore. We also, of course, have information so you can get it both in in hardback and in Kindle. But we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
His book coming out next week, The Church of Tov. And again, it is a very good book. It's probably one already that you say, I want to get a copy of. I know some people have already benefited from it because, if nothing else, we are writing about an issue that does need to be addressed. We're going to talk about the Circle of Tov and how to really create Tov churches in just a minute. But I thought, Scott, for just a minute, we might just at least talk about Matthew 18, because your chapter there help me understand that oftentimes what happens when there is abuse, when there is a scandal, the quick response is, well, have you followed Matthew 18, which, of course, is the whole issue of church discipline. But you help us understand, using one of those examples, at least from Willow Creek, how that was actually used in an inappropriate way. And so it's something to be looking out for, don't you think?
Yes, it is. And this was a deep concern to my daughter, Laura Berenger, my co-author, because of their participation at Willow Creek. All right, let's just say that I am in your church, Kerby, and I start saying bad things about you that are false. What's the proper response? Well, you become aware of it, and you talk to me, and you say, let's get together and talk about this. Let's figure out what's going on here. That seems totally appropriate, and that's what Matthew 18 is about. Well, what happens when a man of power, narcissistic, who operates through fear, sexually abuses a female in the church, and then makes the claim that, first of all, we have to follow Matthew 18, which means you have to meet with me one-on-one. No psychologist in history, no genuinely pastorally sensitive person ever would say that that is a necessary stipulation. Maybe you meet with 2 or 3 others, but to go to that person privately is simply to trigger the original abuse and put yourself in a position again of probably being abused verbally and with authority again. And even then, when it goes to 2 or 3, it can be very dangerous. So, and then other people appeal to the point in the pastorals that without the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses, no charge should be laid against an elder. Well, you know, this one also was used at Willow. I've heard it used in other churches. This is not uncommon. It's a great protective advice, and it seems so biblical. But listen, how many males abuse females in the presence of another witness? I mean, it is almost impossible to find situations like that. These are things done behind closed doors privately so that no one can say anything. So these biblical verses are not to be used indiscriminately, insensitively, and without compassion for other people. And I cannot tell you, Kerby, the number of people who have written to me or have written to my daughter, who have tried to contact us in all sorts of ways, who've been abused in different contexts in churches. And this is one of the most common ploys used by churches, is to say, did you follow Matthew 18? Did you follow the pastoral epistles? And people say, well, this is God's word. I've done wrong, and I'm afraid to meet with that pastor, so I'll just be silent. And then guess who wins? The abusive pastor and the culture around that pastor that is sycophantic and operating through fear. So we need to use Matthew 18 well. We need to use it when it's appropriate. We need to use other passages when it's more appropriate to use other passages.
Let's get about into that culture. Your first section there is creating a goodness culture, and it gets us back to the point you make. Church culture matters. And, of course, Andy Crouch has been on the program with us before, and this whole idea of culture is important, and so we should be doing what we can to have a flourishing, God-centered, Christ-like culture within the church. Give us some ideas on what we can possibly do in order to make that happen.
Well, let me just say, Tov is something, and goodness is something about God. It's God's design for all creation, for everything is created, for each of us, that we are called to be Tov people, which means we do the good thing, we do the right thing, we do the loving thing, we do the compassionate thing, and it is ultimately God's approval. But I often tell my students, because I teach in a seminary, that the beginning of the word gospel is Tov. It is the good news is Tov news, is that the whole gospel is good news. We need to help work on forming cultures of people who live with one another in Tov relationships, who do Tov things so that Tov begins to flourish. And yes, Andy Crouch has written about this eloquently. I read all that he writes, well, his books that he's written. And I think that he helps us a lot. And I go back to David Brooks, that we should never underestimate the significance of the culture where we work or live, because it's going to make us into the person who fits into that culture. And we want that culture to be Tov. Now, I'm asked this all the time. We're asked, how can we help form a Tov culture? I believe that we have to look to ourselves before God to say, I want to become an agent of Tov in my world. And then I think we form ourselves in relationship with 2 or 3 or 4 or up to 12 people where we are committed to Tov. Now, not everybody's going to be using this Hebrew word. I understand that. But people can be committed to Tov and not know that that's what they're committed to. They want to be committed to things like compassion and treating people as people, having names and stories, and not just, somebody who can fill an activity on Sunday, and if they're not there, we'll get somebody else. And if they don't do the job, we'll get rid of them, and we don't even know their name. We want to become people committed to Tov, and we want to surround ourselves with other people who are Tov. And this is what I believe can happen, Kerby. And this is so important, that we can form pockets of Tov.
Yes.
And if we get enough pockets of Tov in a church, we can, in that sense, we can take over with Tov. We can knock out toxicity, and we can build Tov. I talked with a person who has a PhD in organizational transformation. I didn't even know there were degrees like this. And he said this to me. He said, when you have a toxic culture, it takes 7 years of intentional activity to transform a culture. And then he used my language, from toxicity to Tov. I went, whoa. A lot of us like to think that we could have a Sunday school class devoted for 1 quarter on Tov, and all of a sudden it would all be fixed. But that's not how it works. This is the slow activity of God's transforming grace through the power of the Spirit as we seek out the kinds of habits and practices and actions that are Tov, so that our characters are formed into Tov, and we form these pockets of Tov, and over time we can create churches that are Tov. I've been in churches like this. They don't even know they're Tov, but they are. I've been in churches that are toxic, and they don't think they are, but they are. So we need, I'm fully committed to the process over time of committing myself and those around me to being people of Tov, responding the right way in these situations, asking God's grace, asking God's Spirit to give us the grace so that we can become agents of Tov.
And again, one of the wonderful diagrams in this book is kind of the circle of Tov. And when we come back from the break, maybe we'll talk about a few, because some of the negatives then become positives. You nurture empathy. That helps you resist a narcissistic culture. You nurture grace, and that helps you resist a fear culture. You tell the truth to resist false narratives. You nurture justice to resist this loyalty culture. You nurture service to resist the celebrity culture. And you nurture Christ-likeness to resist the leader culture. And so we'll come back and pick off one or two. But again, you can find all of this in this book that is getting published by Tyndale, about 230 pages. Scot McKnight with us, and I think you will certainly appreciate this. And we have a link so that you can get it both in hardback and Kindle, and it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and talk about this Circle of Tov right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A Church Called Tov by Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer. And again, this is a book that I think you're going to want to get a copy of, and we have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. And Scott, really what we're talking about here is taking these various issues that you've already identified as problems and recognizing that Tov churches nurture empathy, grace, truth, justice, service, Christ-likeness, which is what churches churches should be doing anyway. And that is then, if you will, an antidote to the toxic culture that many churches might find themselves in.
Exactly. And what we did is my daughter and I mapped the kinds of cultures that we were seeing that produced toxic cultures and produced toxic relationships with, let's say, men and women in churches and younger people and abuse of other leaders. We saw so much of this. And we asked the question, what are the kinds of things that we see about these people, and what is the biblical alternative? And so we saw that in toxic church cultures, it's a narcissist culture, it's a power through fear culture, it is what I call institution creep, where the institution becomes more important than people, where there are false narratives that are easy to tell, and Kerby, this one is really bothersome to me, and that is that churches who are following Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, who is the truth, and we believe that God is the truth, the gospel is the truth, we become captive to false narratives to protect our own egos and our own narcissism. We found that they demanded loyalty even when it was wrong. They didn't pursue justice. We found that they were propping up hero cultures and celebrity cultures, and they were casting images of their primary leaders on screens that made them look like they were from Hollywood. They sold images, basically, rather than reality. And we found that churches that are toxic are enamored with celebrity. Churches that are Tov are enamored with service. And this is one that I pick on. I believe that pastors are leaders, that churches have to have leaders. But when we begin to fashion our pastors as leaders and the leaders in churches as leaders, we often lose contact with what the primary point is. Pastors are to pastor people, and that means nurturing their spiritual formation. They're not leaders, they're pastors. And so I'm down on the culture that has reshaped church leadership into the categories of business leadership, and I'm up on recovering the biblical category of pastors as shepherds, pastors as pastors, pastors as spiritual mentors, pastors as spiritual directors, pastors as teachers of the Bible, as followers of Jesus themselves, etc. And I think that this is what we discovered, is that toxic cultures were just enamored with things like narcissism and fear and power. And we saw that the biblical way, the way of Jesus, when you look at how he lived, even when you look at the Apostle Paul, who's not perfect, or Peter, who's not perfect, you see characteristics that are not present in narcissism and power cultures. There's empathy. There is grace. They see people and they say, how can God's grace transform this person? I know people who are scared to death when they're on the platform on Sunday that they will make a mistake because they could be humiliated in the church meeting on Monday or Tuesday.
Yes.
And I think to myself, isn't Jesus one who said to his disciples, what you did was wrong, now start following me again? Over and over,
yes.
The apostles made mistakes. Jesus doesn't disown them. He doesn't humiliate them. He says that was wrong. Now we need to get back on the path and work toward something else. And he showed them grace and forgiveness. And one of the big ones for me is that we have to become a people-first culture. I believe that we need to know people's names and we need to know their stories. And we are not leaders or pastors of people whose names we don't know and whose stories we don't know. And what I have learned, and what my daughter and I learned, is churches that are Tov know one another. They know one another's stories, and they empathize and sympathize and show compassion and grace toward people because they know who those others are. They know who they are themselves. They know we are all in need of grace and forgiveness. So these are some of the characteristics that I think are really important for us to form cultures of Tov. And that, when I look at the circle of Tov, Kerby, I don't look at it as perfection. I look at it as things we should strive for that we're not going to master overnight, that is going to take a lifetime of culture building, but these are such good things, such Tov things, that they're worth giving our lives for in order to form church cultures that will witness to the way of Christ and Christ-likeness in all that we do.
So excited about the book, A Church Called Tov. And again, it's the idea of forming a goodness culture that resists abuses of power and promotes healing. It is a book coming out shortly. But Scott, just before we go, we only got about a minute or two left. It seems to me that this is a book that maybe even certain people in church leadership should go through. And so it could be not only something that the pastor could preach on, or it could be something that the elders, deacons get together on, maybe others having a small group, because after all, you're looking for really almost a 7-year commitment if you want to turn some things around, aren't you?
Yeah. We like to say that this, Laura and I like to say that this book is, first of all, for the wounded resistors. Kerby, there are many people in churches who've been wounded by powerful pastors, narcissistic pastors, and they wonder if they can give their heart to a church again. And this is really sad. That's the group that we had in mind on every page that we wrote. But we know that sometimes pastors will want to preach through a book like this. But really what we need is all the people who are on, let's say, the leadership team, the elder board, the deacons, the Sunday school teachers, whatever the major influences in your church are, we think they should all read this and work on it together, of how they as leaders can set the tone of Tov for their own church. And that's our heart, is that individual churches will be transformed into cultures of Tov because God's grace is at work in them, leading them toward Christ-likeness.
Very good. Scot McKnight, just been thrilling to have you on the program. Thank you so much for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby. Great. And I want you to know it's an honor for me to be with you.
Well, we look forward to the next opportunity. And again, the book is already coming out, so you can pre-order it. Of course, you will probably find it in your local bookstore soon, but we've made it easy for you to get it both in hardback and in Kindle. And if you think about all the examples and news stories that we've talked about in terms of abuse, this is a book to really help promote healing and safety and spiritual growth. And it really is, again, a book that I commend to you, A Church Called Tov. And I hope that you will take the time to look up the information we have on our website and get a copy and express those principles to those around you. And you've been listening to Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be covering all sorts of different issues over the next 2 hours. So if you find one interesting issue and you want to stay with it, that's great, and you can call in. If you find an issue maybe isn't so interesting, just hang on, because we're going to move on to another one pretty quickly. We're going to cover 4 or 5 different topics in 2 hours. And then, of course, tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. Looking forward to that as well. Kelly Shackelford hasn't been with us. I'm sure he's going to have a few things to say about that. And, of course, looking forward to the whole roundtable that will join us. In about a half an hour, we're going to have Reggie Littlejohn with us, and we'll talk about a number of things. She, of course, has been the president of the Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and has really focused her time and attention on what is happening in China, especially with the one-child policy and forced abortion and all the rest. We'll first of all talk about the speech that was given by Chen. We've talked about him many times before at the Republican National Convention, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of the great ministry that she's had over the years in China, so we'll really focus some time and attention in just a bit on China. Let me also say, before I get to her, I might also want to talk about China in terms of The Rock. Well, that would be Dwayne Johnson, the highest paid actor in the world, apparently. Also LeBron James and some of the others, because there's a very good piece that's come out to help us understand that sometimes you do need to follow the money. The founder of Point of View was Marlon Maddox, and early on, even when I was fairly young, helping him pretty much as either a guest or as a co-host or a guest host, he used to say so often, follow the money. And I think in just a minute we'll see the incredible influence that China is having, and maybe explains why Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, decided to endorse Joe Biden, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Might also mention in the next hour, Jason Romano will be with us. We'll talk about the uniform of leadership, an individual that worked at ESPN, but also has some great leadership principles there. And before we're all done, we'll also talk in the next hour with Susan Michael. She helped develop the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. And we'll talk about the Israeli UAE Peace Agreement. And I might also mention real quickly that one of the other articles we've posted is on the fact that now Donald Trump has received another Nobel Peace Prize nomination from a different group. This would be the third nomination now the president has received. As I've said before, don't think it's going to happen. If the announcement had happened after the election, maybe a slim possibility. But since the announcement's going to take place a week from tomorrow, first of all, some of the announcements on the Nobel Prize come on Monday. The one on Peace Prize comes next week. I looked it up just because I wanted to check that out. I just don't think there's any way that those individuals in Norway would actually give him the Nobel Peace Prize while he's running for office, since I suspect quite a number of those individuals that are voting on that would actually support Joe Biden rather than Donald Trump. But we'll see, and that will be something we'll find out on Friday, but I'm not holding my breath. But let's get to the media. And the third article that we've posted here is by John Stossel, in which he points out that the media shows a great deal of bias, and he uses a couple of examples. He points out that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, the Washington Post had a headline, "A Pioneer Devoted to Equality." But when Justice Antonin Scalia died, the headline was, "Supreme Court Conservative Dismayed Liberals." Okay, you got that one. I love this one, though. When the founder of ISIS was killed, austere religious scholar at helm of Islamic State dies. Oh, my goodness. That's, just unbelievable. But then the contrast John Stossel uses is when Donald Trump's brother died just recently, younger brother of president who filed lawsuit against niece dies. And so, you can see the bias. I won't read them all because you can kind of get the idea, and you've seen them yourself. So then it's a part of an interview that John Stossel has done with Joe Concha. Joe Concha, if you're not familiar, he's the media reporter for The Hill. And I have very high respect for The Hill, especially for Joe Concha. And so one of the things people were saying, well, these are all softball questions. But Joe Concha says it's not even softball. It's T-ball, except when you put a beach ball on the tee. Great visual image there, if nothing else. And then, again, as John Stossel likes to do, pushes back and said, yeah, well, what about this idea? CNN talked about mostly peaceful protest, and then CNN defended themselves, citing a study that showed that 93% of the protest were peaceful. Well, again, Joe Concha would have none of it. He said, that's silly. When planes crash, we don't put 99% landed safely on the screen. Joe Concha instead said, when people start dying and losing their businesses, that's your story. And then goes on to talk about the fact that whenever the particular statistics being used, especially during COVID-19, are favorable for the president, they change the way they look at the statistics. For example, they pointed out that CNN was very critical of the president because when people were pointing out that the United States has not done a great number of tests, he said, wait, we've done more tests than any other country. So then CNN correctly pointed out that if you look at per capita tests, well, South Korea and Italy tested many more times. But then they turned right around when the president was saying that if you actually look at the number of deaths per capita, the United States is not looking so bad. Instead, the United States is listed by CNN as having more coronavirus cases than any country in the world. But if you adjust for population, and that didn't really show up in the debate last night, did it? Or the night before, I should say. Then there are 28 countries, including France, England, Ireland, and Norway, that have more cases per capita. So again, it's just a good illustration of how facts and figures and statistics are used to actually advance an idea. And one last one is that Joe Concha and John Stossel spent some time talking about during the Democratic National Convention. CNN, for example, since they were picking on CNN, didn't bother to fact check any of the speeches by the Democrats. But during the speech by especially Donald Trump, you even had a black ticker tape fact-checking along the way. And one example of where fact-checking really would have helped is they use one, and they give you lots of examples, but I'll just pick out one, since Michelle Obama's been in the news lately, former First Lady, complained that Trump put children who were torn from their families and thrown into cages. But nobody, even the commentators, pointed out that that policy actually started under her own husband's administration. So just kind of giving you a little bit of an idea of biased media, and you're seeing that right now with the whole issue of white supremacy. The president didn't do a good job Tuesday night. We got that. But more recently, then he was asked, do you condemn white supremacy? And he says, of course I do, or I condemn that. And then yesterday in the press conference with Kayleigh McEnany, there are all sorts of people saying he didn't condemn white supremacy. And he said he just did. We've got all sorts of videos out there that said he did. No, he said, I condemn that. They were looking for, he has to say, I condemn white supremacy, which we do have in other videos, but nevertheless, that's how the game's played. Now, once he even says that, then they'll say you don't believe it anyway. And, of course, that's opened up a whole can of whoop-you-know-what, or a whole can of Pandora box, because now all sorts of people are pulling in all these videos of Joe Biden at a funeral for a KKK leader, working with the Grand Wizard of the KKK. Of course, his own vice president during the primaries even spent some time talking about how he said very supportive things of various segregationists. But anyway, gives you a little bit of an understanding of this whole idea of biased media. When we come back, is that bias affecting people's endorsement? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager had to admit that he had been wrong. All his life, he has said that the left's moral compass is broken. He has concluded that in order to have a broken compass, you need to have a moral compass to begin with, but the left doesn't have one. He doesn't mean that conclusion as an attack. It is merely an observation that the left doesn't really think in terms of good and evil. You know, we assume that other people think that way because we think that way, but that is not how most of the people on the left perceive the world. He begins with Karl Marx. He divided the world by economic class, the worker and the owner. One group was exploiting the other group. Good and evil aren't really relevant when you're thinking in terms of class struggle. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, operated beyond good and evil. To the Marxists, there is no such thing as a universal good or universal evil. Those of us who perceive the world from a Judeo-Christian worldview see ethics as relevant to the moral standard, not the person or the social status. Dennis Prager then provides a number of examples. Race is more important than ethics, as illustrated by some who argue that looting stores during riots is nothing more than reparations. Another example of a leftist compass is power. Right and wrong are determined by class, rich versus poor, and race, black versus white, and power, strong versus weak. And we see other examples of leftist perspective concerning sex and sexual orientation. We see this playing out vividly when a police officer must confront a person of color. The cop is always wrong, and the perpetrator is always right, regardless of his previous actions or prior criminal record. The moral compass isn't broken. Actually, it doesn't exist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In just a few minutes, we're going to be talking with Reggie Littlejohn, and we're going to obviously talk about what's going on in China, the one-child policy, forced abortion. We're going to talk about a number of other issues as well. They have just an incredible program by which, if you want to help those individuals, Save a Girl campaign in China, Save a Widow campaign in China, and a number of others that I think you'll really want to react to that in a positive way. But I do want to, for just a minute, help you understand how much control China already has over this country. And number one, let me issue this disclaimer. I'm not talking about the Chinese people, many of whom are such wonderful people. If you've ever traveled to this country, if you've had anybody that's come here from China, wonderful people. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Do you have that? Because, again, some of the critical things I'm going to talk about China have to do with the Chinese Communist Party. Number two, I'm going to use Dwayne Johnson as an example, The Rock. Not trying to pick on him, but I am trying to show you the kind of control that China has over actors and actresses, over NBA players, and a number of others. You with me on that? So again, I think I've issued enough disclaimers. Let me get to this piece by Edward Ring, in which he points out, first of all, that according to Forbes magazine, the highest paid actor in the world is Dwayne Johnson. As you may have noticed, if you are out there on Facebook or even watch the news at all, he has endorsed Joe Biden as president. You can go to his Facebook profile, if you'd like, and find out that The Rock decided that he was going to endorse Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the best individuals to lead the country. Now, that's his right. Not necessarily criticizing it, but here, Edward Ring wants you to understand what might be behind it. And the first is that it certainly goes against his fan base. I will trust Edward Ring, who said that if you look through the Facebook post of Dwayne Johnson, there were 100,000 comments, and it is pretty clear that it backfired. Again, I'll trust Edward Ring's numbers from September 28th. Of course, it's 2 days later, and maybe that's changed. But at that time, 95% of the comments aimed at Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, were expressions of anger and feelings of betrayal. Now, again, what you might say is, well, he just decided to do something and say something that might actually contradict his fan base, but he's strong enough and financially stable enough, he can do whatever he wants. Fine. But then Edward Ring goes on and runs the numbers for you and points out that whether you're Dwayne Johnson, or another example he uses is LeBron James, and we've talked about this before with the NBA, or all sorts of other luminaries in sports and screen, you have to understand the incredible power of the Chinese market. I think you could certainly see this when you had a general manager for the Houston Rockets say something supporting those particular freedom protests in Hong Kong and the backlash. But here, let's just run the numbers for Dwayne Johnson and see whether or not money talks. Let's take his film Furious 7. Grossed $353 million in the United States, but it raked in $390 million in China. The Fate of the Furious, which came out 2 years later, grossed about $225 million in the United States, but it actually brought in $392 million in China. If you want to look at some of the most recent ones, Rampage, which is a 2018 film, grossed about $100 million in the United States, but $159 million in China. Skyscraper, which I heard wasn't much of a film, but that's okay, still got $68 million in this country, but it got $98 million, almost $100 million in China. Do you see the point? There is more money to be made in China. You don't want to do anything to ruffle the feathers of the Chinese Communist government. So that's the point. Here's something else that's kind of intriguing that Edward Ring points out, and then I'll leave it at this, and that is to simply point out that in this country we have now about 40,000 movie theaters, most of which are not open, struggling to be able to reopen. But in China, you have 70,000 movie theaters that have been reopened since last month, actually 2 months now since it was reopened in August. And here's something else. There's a lot of possibility for expansion because in the United States, you have about 2 movie screens per 100,000 people. In China, you only have 5 movie screens for every 100,000 people. So there's tremendous room for growth. The future for people that are going to be watching television, and they love NBA basketball, or watching movies, and they love The Rock and some of these others, is China. He goes on to point out some other things as well. I did not know this, but there's also a brand of tequila that Dwayne Johnson has produced, and the Chinese are starting to discover tequila. They already drink a number of other alcoholic beverages, and so the market is, very large indeed. Now, did he do all this simply because he wanted to placate China? I don't know. But it's a reminder in this particular piece, the incredible power because of the size of China, 1 billion people, and the size of its consumer market, that in some respects already people are starting to dance to its tune. Of course, you can look at the movie Mulan and some of the others where there's been controversy. And I just thought, if nothing else, since we're going to be talking about China in just a minute, you might want to know about that as it relates to people like LeBron James and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Just before we take a break, I just had to end on what is just one of these roll your eye, head turner kinds of things. And that is, the story came out a couple of days ago, and I kept waiting for somebody to say, okay, he was just trolling you. This is something that was actually in the Babylon Bee. This was part of the Onion. Sometimes when I bring Kelly in here, I go, you've got to be making this up. And this one is amazing. But a couple of days ago, Zachary Ferreira first got my attention about this, about a professor at Ohio State, since we have our listeners up there in the Buckeye State, and posted what he called a groveling apology in a particular journal, confessing his racism and his offense. Well, he actually wrote a piece called "Why America Needs College Football." That's it. And again, he says, in what reads like a hostage note from someone held in a North Korean prison, the professor states that words like distraction and cheer serve to erase the present painful moments within the nation, especially the black community. And he says, I'm a white man haunted by my ignorance, and talks about this horribly racist example that he wrote. And so I waited a few days thinking, certainly he's got to be trolling us. This thing is so bizarre, you can't even imagine. Well, Charlie Cook wrote the other day, again, the professor at Ohio State has managed to pen a piece of what he calls craven absurdity so perfect in scale and composition that it's difficult to imagine how it might ever be topped. The essay has it all. It possesses the quality of a confession extracted under torture. It's just amazing. And then goes through and has some of the quotes from it. But in the interest of time, let me just cut to one of the very interesting comments, because the professor there actually says he's experiencing physical pain as a punishment for his perfidy. He said, I have a deep ache, the product of the damage that has been done. And why wouldn't he, given that his viewpoint on the value and utility of college football at Ohio State was a product of unformed and uninformed and disconnected whiteness, which positions student athletes as white property, places the onus of responsibility on democratic healing on black communities whose very lives are in danger every single day, and asks the black community to benefit from ideals they can't access. By the way, there's all sorts of very good quotes in here by Charlie Cook about various African-American players that were actually calling for college football to be played. I suspect for no other reason because they wanted to play, also because they wanted to be able to prove themselves so that they can maybe get an NFL contract. But nevertheless, near the end of this long, tearful apology, you have the Professor Mayhew, says he's unsure how he can continue on in the world of academia after having done something as genuinely appalling as to write on the internet that Americans enjoy football and would probably benefit from its return. And so he also then admits that he really hates that his students will have to carry my ignorant, racist energy with them at all times, and then is also concerned about his co-author, Mushba Shaheen, who wrote the piece with him, wondering what would happen to him as well. If you want to have any idea of how bizarre some of this has become in terms of the issue of systemic racism being used as an excuse, the argument that any activity that somebody doesn't like is called whiteness, and the cancel culture, and the need to apologize for almost anything you write about, including college football, here is perhaps one of the best examples that we can possibly have. Anyway, just wanted to share some of that with you. And when we come back from the break, Reggie Littlejohn will be with us. She is the founder and president of the Women's Rights Without Frontiers. She was really the first person to let us know who this blind activist was, and certainly is going to help us understand what's happening in China, how we can pray for the Chinese people, and how we can make a difference. All that coming up right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Focusing our time and attention on China. Today is the 71st anniversary of the Chinese takeover. And of course, we just a few minutes ago were talking about the disproportionate influence that it has on actors and sports figures and others. But within the country, of course, we're talking about the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims. We're talking about what has been happening in Hong Kong. And of course, if you have listened any length of time to Point of View, you know that on a pretty regular basis, we've had Reggie Reggie Littlejohn on to talk about the coercive population control that still exists there and the one-child policy, forced abortion, and all the rest. We're going to spend some time today, of course, talking with her about that, and also have posted not only a link to her website, womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. You don't have to remember all that because we have a link there as well. But also we have a great transcript and link to the speech by Chen Guangcheng's speech at the Republican National Convention. Reggie Littlejohn is the founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, a graduate of Yale Law School. He's been a leading voice in this whole issue to expose and oppose forced abortion and gendercide. And this has been an organization that has saved a lot of lives. I know she's going to be going to a wedding of girls that were rescued from China. And we also want to point you to her Save a Girl campaign, as well as the Save a Widow campaign. So there are just a lot of things to talk about. Reggie Littlejohn, thank you once again for joining us here at Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Let's, if we can, talk about Chen Guangcheng. The first time I ever heard the name came from you in studio. Most of our listeners probably have said, I remember that name because I've heard it on Point of View. And all of a sudden, we see him giving a speech at the Republican National Convention. Now, talk about that, because it was encouraging for me to see that, again, the president wanted people that were watching the convention to know what is happening in China, especially what happens under the Chinese Communist Party. But I'm sure you were very encouraged that he had a chance to actually have a spot and to give that speech.
Oh, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Okay, so I spent years doing almost nothing else but campaigning for his release. This is what just for by way of background, Chen Guangcheng has been blind since age 3. He and his wife took the lead in exposing the forced abortions and the forced sterilizations in his area of China, Linyi, China, in 2005. And for that, they were jailed and tortured. He finally got out of jail. He was under house arrest. It was a long story, but that's when I was just globetrotting, and there, I think I must have traveled 200 or 300 days that year. Anyway, point is, he was, through a long story, he was able to get out of China. He was able to get to the United States. He's now one of my dearest friends, and never, ever did I dream when he was languishing in jail or under house arrest in China that I would ever be watching him on TV speaking at the Republican National Convention. And never did I dream that I would be able to just pick up the phone and congratulate him and have, a conversation with him. I mean, these kinds of things just don't happen. But there are two things that are very important about that speech. Number one is Chen Guangcheng's message. And one of the things that he said was, quote, the CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party, is an enemy of humanity. It is terrorizing its own people, and it is threatening the well-being of the world. And what Chen Guangcheng was doing was basically, he actually said, we need to fight for President Trump. I was kind of surprised, to hear him say that because he's a nonprofit. But anyway, he said it, okay? So he went out and just went out on a limb and went ahead and said we need to fight for President Trump because basically freedom in China and in the world depend on stopping this appeasement diplomacy that has been the policy of administrations, Democratic and Republican, before President Trump. And then the second message that was really important from that comes from President Trump. He's the one who made the decision to put Chen Guangcheng up there. Yes. And what he's saying is to China, he's the first person to really stand up to China and say, look, we are not going to take it anymore in terms of your human rights atrocities. And I think I applaud him for that.
And again, I would certainly second what you had to say. The sad reality is, whether we had a Democratic president or Republican president, no one has really challenged China. And if you think, well, now certainly Joe Biden would do so, go back and look at the kind of financial benefits that they're already receiving, and look at what we talked about even before you got on the air about those individuals that can't say anything negative about China because it might affect the ratings for the NBA games or the ratings or the number of people that that go to movies and those kinds of things. So it's pretty incredible. And again, I appreciate your humility, but I've seen so many pictures of Chen Guangcheng with you standing next to him that it isn't just somebody that you can get up and call. I think you met him and he got off the airport, and you've been with him almost ever since. And he's given quite a bit of testimony. So first of all, Reggie, before we move on to all the wonderful things that you're doing there at Women's Rights Without Frontiers, we did post, and it's from your website, the entire transcript. And so my suggestion, and see if you would agree with this, would be for our listeners that are concerned about what's happening in China to take this transcript or to take this link and put it on their Facebook page, or maybe have it as a Twitter post or something like that, because not everybody watched the Republican National Convention, but really in essentially 4 paragraphs, and really some of them just introductory, so really in 2 paragraphs, essentially he makes a very compelling case for why we should support the Chinese people and why we should oppose the Chinese Communist Party. Don't you think?
I completely agree with that, Kerby, and this is a distinction that needs to be made, is that people who stand up to the Chinese government are not standing against the Chinese people. They're standing for the Chinese people, because the Chinese people do not have freedom of speech. And anybody who talks the way that I'm talking right now in China, I mean, I would already have cadres at my door dragging me away. You just can't do it in China. And so I really appreciate your giving me the opportunity to voice these views. But yeah, Chen Guangcheng is taking a big risk by doing what he did, and anyone who comes from China, or even from within China, who's willing to stand up for human rights, we owe it to them to repeat their message, because they have done this at unimaginable sacrifices to themselves and to their families.
We can talk about some of the other resources, because I knew you were going to be on. I also, of course, go to your website, and the first article I found was about this Chinese widow who was thinking of committing suicide, and so that's on your website. But more importantly, let's, if we can, highlight 2 different outreaches. One is, of course, the Save a Widow campaign to help these destitute widows in rural China, and this wonderful picture of this one individual who said she was just too sad to live, finally had some hope because one of your field workers was able to give her some hope. So talk about that, because I think some of our listeners might want to be involved.
Oh, I hope that they do become involved, and thank you for that question. So this particular woman, I mean, her husband died. She was destitute, and then her son just in June committed suicide. And she believes that the reason he committed suicide was that in China, because of the gender imbalance, because of the sex-selective abortion of baby girls, now men and their families are expected to provide an actual physical home before they can get married, before they can even attract a girlfriend. And she thinks that he had borrowed so much money to try to attract a girlfriend that he couldn't pay it back. He didn't attract a girlfriend, and he killed himself. And so, of course, I think that many parents, when their kids commit suicide, are at risk of suicide. And she was saying she was too sad to live, and we just found her just in time and just basically told her, you're a human being created in God's image, and you are of infinite value, and we love you, and God loves you, and we give them, the widows, $25 a month because they are just completely destitute in rural China without anyone to support them because of the one-child policy, because their kids, there's not enough of a family to support them. And we give them hope, and we give them dignity. And all of our widows are desperate in various different ways.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to give people some action items. But even as we go to a break, you can go to this website, and it is womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. But you don't even have to remember all that, because simply go to pointofview.net, click on that picture of Reggie Littlejohn, and you'll see that. And we've talked about the Save a Widow. I want to talk about Save a Girl campaign, and also maybe end on a fun note, because I know you're going to a wedding, and this is from girls who were rescued from China. I thought we might talk about that as well. But if you find yourself saying, I really have a heart for China, and many of my friends do, I've got a number of Asians, even in my own Sunday school class, some who are from China, others have a Chinese background. It's been real hard to think about going into China right now, but there are other ways we can have an encouragement and help and hope. And so we're going to talk about that. And again, we have some great material on our website, pointofview.net. We'll talk about these very important outreaches right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Reggie Littlejohn for just a few more minutes. Again, president and founder of the Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and you can go to that website, which is available on our website as well, pointofview.net. We've talked about a number of things. First of all, we have the Chen speech at the Republican National Convention. If you've never had a chance to hear him speak or never could maybe watch it at that time, or maybe even because English is not his first language, you might want to read the speech. It was very powerful, and we make that available, first of all, for you to read, and second of all, for you to post. So I really want to give you an assignment to take it and figure out, maybe you can put it on a Facebook page or a Twitter post or something of that nature, send it to some individuals, and that will certainly focus some time and attention on China. Also, of course, you could provide a link to womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org, and when you go there, of course, one of the buttons says Save a Widow. But Reggie, let's, if we can, talk about the other button, Save a Girl. That campaign is one really finding women who are about to abort or abandon their children. And you've had a great opportunity to reach out to those women. So tell us more, if you might.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. Yes, the Save a Girl campaign was the original campaign. And by the way, I should mention, we are the only organization in the world with a network of field workers on the ground inside of China. saving girls and widows, because it's very, very difficult, especially under the repressive leadership of Xi Jinping, for a foreign organization to be on the ground inside of China. So because of the one-child policy, now the two-child policy, girls are selectively aborted because of son preference, and that's led to a situation where there's between 30 and 40 million more men living in China than women, which has led to sex trafficking and other horrible consequences. But what we do is, in our area of rural China, we can find out through the network if somebody is, a woman is being pressured to abort or abandon her baby because she's a girl. Or if she's a victim of such grinding poverty that her daughter would be at risk. We're able to go to her door and say to her, congratulations on your daughter. Please don't abort or abandon her because she's a girl. She's a precious daughter, and we will give you a monthly stipend of $25. Okay, so that's the Chinese equivalent of $25 a month for a year to empower you to keep your daughter. And what that does for the woman is, number one, she's able to hear the message that girls are as good as boys, probably for the first time in her life. And number two, she can go to her mother-in-law, who's usually the one who's pressuring her to abort, and say, look, I can't abort. I can't abandon this baby girl. She's a lucky girl. Look, she's already bringing money into the family. So we have saved literally hundreds of baby girls this way in the Chinese countryside.
Incredible. How can people get involved with you? Because that is just a great opportunity for people to be those who are, in a sense, becoming the hands and feet of Jesus.
Well, that's right. Just go onto my website, womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org, and click on Save a Girl. You can learn a little bit more about the campaign. There's a nice video there about the campaign where you can see the actual faces of the baby girls, some of the ones that we've saved. And you can choose to donate. I mean, it's $25 to help support one baby girl for a month, and it's $300 for a year. And this is the only way that you can actually get money into the hands of a desperate mother in China who's trying to save her daughter. You can directly get the resources. Everybody who donates to that campaign, 100% of it goes towards that campaign, nothing towards the administration of the organization. So that's how they can get involved with that.
Very good. Just before we run out of time, you're leaving this weekend for a wedding of these girls that were rescued from China. Tell us the story.
Okay. So this is not a typical adoption. This is a situation where there is an activist named Zhang Lin who was heavily persecuted inside of China, jailed, tortured. They couldn't shut him up. So the Chinese government actually kidnapped his daughter, Annie, out of her fourth grade classroom. She was 10 years old, detained her overnight, would not allow her to go to school, put her and her father under house arrest. They escaped house arrest, became fugitives, and when they were caught, the father, Zhang Lin, got word out to me saying, please, can you help me get Annie out of China to the United States? She can't lead a normal life here. So that was in 2013. Her older sister escorted her here, but then they both ended up staying here. We are still raising Annie. We've been raising her as our own daughter in our home. She's 17 years old. She's applying to colleges, and her older sister is getting married this on October 10th. So she's been a wonderful, very successful immigrant to the United States, doing great in school, has a wonderful job, and is marrying a very fine Christian man. And we're just so pleased with how well both of them are doing.
So good. Just before we go, like I said, let's talk about how people can get involved. Of course, they can click on those buttons about Save a Girl, Save a Widow. Of course, we have the speech by Chen. Also, there's a petition to stop forced abortion. There are some other resources and some other action items because, as you know, Reggie, we have quite a number of activists listen to Point of View, and China's been in the news, and that's why we wanted to talk about it today on what is sadly the 71st anniversary of the Chinese takeover. But how else can people use some of the material on your website?
Well, actually, what I was thinking was, please pray for the field workers, okay? Because they are taking their freedom into their hand every morning. They get up knowing that they could be detained for what they're doing, but they are so determined to save these lives of these baby girls and these widows that they do it anyway, and just cry out to God that He will continue to protect them, and that and keep them under the shadow of His wing. That's a major thing. So please pray for them. And then the rest of it is, if you want to have a direct, support on this earth, then you can go on the website and click some of the buttons that you mentioned to support our campaigns.
Well, Reggie, we always appreciate you being on the program, and thank you once again for joining us here on the 71st anniversary of the Chinese takeover. And it's been great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
So do I. Thank you so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some principles of leadership. Jason Romano will be with us, and also Susan Michael will be with us. She's with the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. I thought you would appreciate that. And while, again, we see a third Nobel Peace Prize being nominated for Donald Trump, not sure it's going to go anywhere, but we'll see. We also have posted a very good piece, which Susan Michael has been quoted in, on the Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain peace accord. So we'll talk about some of those issues in the next hour. Let me just mention real quickly that my Viewpoints commentary today has the title Moral Compass, and it's based upon Dennis Prager, who said, I guess I have to admit that I'm wrong. He used to say that he felt that the left's moral compass was broken. He finally has concluded, no, that would assume you have a moral compass, and it's that they really don't have a moral compass. And he doesn't mean that as an attack as much as it's just an observation that individuals that are part of the left, not necessarily liberals, but we make a distinction between the left and liberals, that the left really doesn't operate in terms of good and evil. And he gives you one example of Karl Marx looking at the whole issue of the world needs to be evaluated economically, the worker and the owner. You can use other examples that I've used as well, because you have some of the atheists that don't think in terms of good and evil because they don't believe there's any good or evil, because there's no God, there's no moral standard. And so in some respects, we make a mistake as Christians to think that some people just have a broken moral compass, when maybe it's much wiser to at least start with the assumption that they don't even have a moral compass. And that's what the Viewpoints commentary is all about. So again, it is available on the website, pointofview.net, and you might want to subscribe if you don't already receive it in your inbox, and that will be the case as we send it out Monday through Friday. And we send out penned extras on Saturday. So 6 days of the week, you get a commentary from Point of View. It's free. We'd be glad to get it to you. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about leadership right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about this book, which we've mentioned before, but we thought we would come back and give it a maybe even a fuller, more interview. And that is The Uniform of Leadership. Came out in July. Lessons on True Success from My ESPN Life. And it's written by Jason Romano. And I might just mention we have information about him on the website. Host and producer of Sports Spectrum podcast. Also a contributor to Sports Spectrum magazine, writes a number of articles for sportspectrum.com. But during his time at ESPN, really created and produced a number of things, of course, Sports Central, Monday Night Football, and a variety of others that you would all be familiar with. But this is a book that talks about some of the lessons that he learned at ESPN. You think about learning lessons in terms of leadership in the military, maybe in business, but yes, you can learn them as well at ESPN. So, Jason, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having me.
Once again, remind people how you ended up there. Of course, obviously, anybody that loves sports knows ESPN, but in some respects, I thought it'd be good just to kind of give people kind of the background story once again.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I never even dreamed about working at ESPN as a kid because it felt so out of reach. I was a kid, grew up, loved sports, played sports, watched it. It was my God in a lot of ways. And, through that, decided once I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, probably in my teen years, that, well, I could talk about sports or pursue a career in sports broadcasting. And so did that, went to college, got a career, started out of college in local radio in my hometown of Albany, New York, and then ESPN came calling around 3 years later, 20 years ago, if you will, in the year 2000, and started my career off there, and it was a blast. It was so much more than I could have expected, just working in a place where, quite frankly, was a dream of mine in terms of what you watch growing up. And again, I don't think I dreamed big enough to think I could actually work there. But once I got there, I was living the dream job. Let's just put it that way.
Certainly. Again, we have a link to your website, jasonromano.com. And one of the things you talk about early on in the book, but also on your website, is the question, what uniform are you wearing? The uniform of leadership. And I love how you kind of take us through, when we wear uniforms, we figure out it's just to really basically separate one particular team from another. But there's a lot more that goes into that. And as a Christian, you've really begun to think about this as well. What uniform are we going to wear, and how are we going to apply our biblical ideas in the environment in which we were? Up until fairly recently, though, you were thinking, probably need to hide some of that. Maybe you need to cover over that uniform. But speak to that issue, if you might.
Yeah, Kerby. So the uniform, it's one of those things. It's sort of a metaphor, that you're trying to find kind of a sports connection to this metaphor of the uniform of leadership. So every day we wake up, we have a choice to make. Who are we going to play for? What team are we going to play for? Because every day, all of us wake up, we put on this sort of metaphorical uniform and make a decision on the team that we're going to play for first. And quite often, because of the selfishness that's within us and the nature of who we are and the things that kind of distract us every day, the very first team that we think about playing for is ourselves. Now, if you look at a uniform, a typical sports uniform, there's a name on the front. That's usually the team. and then the name on the back, that's usually the athlete or the player.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say when we wake up, we have to make a decision. Are we going to play for the team on the front, or are we going to play for the name on the back?
Yes.
And a lot of us mix that up, including myself. For many years, I would wake up and the first thing I'd think about was Jason and not others, or in essence, God. And so wearing the uniform of leadership properly is having God first, it's placing others second, or the team second, and then ourselves third. I call it I am third. And it's really important, I think, for all of us, especially those of us who are Christians, to get that order in its proper place. It's something that we mess up. We're going to mess up every day. Thank God for his grace. But I think when we get it right, when we realize every day that our job is to love God and love others first and then ourselves, man, I think that's when things start to line up and really, really align in the proper way.
We've been pleased that on one occasion we've had Tony Dungy in studio, and you talk about early on that it was one question by Tony Dungy, which was very significant because he was on Mike and Mike, and then he asked you a question that really got you thinking and really, in some respects, changed the direction of your life, didn't it?
It absolutely did, and I'm so glad you brought this up because Coach Dungy, just like you had him in your studio, we had him at ESPN at our studios about 10 years ago, 2010. And my job at that point was a producer. I was booking the talent and securing the guests to come in and be on the different shows at ESPN. We called it the ESPN Car Wash.
Mm-hmm.
And it had nothing to do with cars or water. It was just a day of interviews at ESPN. And so Coach Dungy is coming, and he's promoting his book, The Mentor Leader, and I'm excited because as a believer, I'm a younger believer at that time, but I'm a believer, and I know that he is too, and I'm thinking, wow, this is going to be such a great day to spend with someone who has, his faith in its proper place, and maybe we'll get to talk about matters that are a little bit deeper than just the regular sports conversation that I have every day. And so we find ourselves in the green room adjacent to the Mike and Mike studios after he finishes his interview on Mike and Mike, and, he's curious and kind of asks me a question. Finds out from his people that he's with, his producers and associates, that I'm a Christian. And so he says, Jason, I understand you're a follower of Christ. I have one question for you. How do you live your faith out in the workplace here at ESPN?
Mm.
And I've never been asked that question, Kirby, and I was kind of caught off guard, and I really didn't have a good answer. In fact, I told Coach Dungy, I don't even think that's possible. How silly am I when I think back now?
Yeah.
I said, I think the way I'm supposed to be living out my faith is if I'm going to do that, I need to go work for a place like, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes or some sort of ministry or sports ministry, not at a place like ESPN. Well, it wasn't Coach Dungy. The question that he asked changed my life, but the response from his assistant, Jessica, was what really got me going. She stood right in front of Coach Dungy before he could respond, and I know he wanted to, and she looks at me kind of with this stern look and says, listen, you don't really get what Coach was asking here, do you? Look at where you work. And I said, yeah, I work at ESPN. She's like, no, look at the ministry. Look at the light that you can be to all of these people. There's 4,000 people here on campus at ESPN, and what a great opportunity for you to be the light of Christ to all of these people. And I just got it. It's like a light bulb just shined brightly above my head, and it made sense. I said, oh, I get it now. That's what you mean. I can be, and here's what happened, Kirby. That day going forward, I went from being a producer at ESPN who happened to be a Christian to being a Christian who happened to be a producer at ESPN. And that order is really important because for me, I understood and I recognized, oh, wait, I'm a follower of Christ first wherever I go, whether it's to the workplace, whether it's at the house with my wife and my daughter, whether it's at church, whether it's at the market, at the gas station, wherever I go, I'm a follower of Christ first, and that order is important. So that's why that question changed my life. And going forth, it really helped me kind of align in its proper form what it was like to be a believer in the workplace. And I know a lot of us struggle with that.
Sure. Let's take a break. And first of all, we wanted you to know about the book. Of course, we've talked about this before, and we have it available again, both in hardback and in Kindle. But we also have a link to his website. Back then, we weren't sure about speaking opportunities, but we're going to talk about that, too, because you may want to have him come and speak at your gathering. So we'll talk about this right after that.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Dennis Prager had to admit that he had been wrong. All his life, he has said that the left's moral compass is broken. He has concluded that in order to have a broken compass, you need to have a moral compass to begin with, but the left doesn't have one. He doesn't mean that conclusion as an attack. It is merely an observation that the left doesn't really think in terms of good and evil. You know, we assume that other people think that way because we think that way, but that is not how most of the people on the left perceive the world. He begins with Karl Marx. He divided the world by economic class, the worker and the owner. One group was exploiting the other group. Good and evil aren't really relevant when you're thinking in terms of class struggle. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, operated beyond good and evil. To the Marxists, there is no such thing as a universal good or universal evil. Those of us who perceive the world from a Judeo-Christian worldview see ethics as relevant to the moral standard, not the person or the social status. Dennis Prager then provides a number of examples. Race is more important than ethics, as illustrated by some who argue that looting stores during riots is nothing more than reparations. Another example of a leftist compass is power. Right and wrong are determined by class, rich versus poor, and race, black versus white, and power, strong versus weak. And we see other examples of leftist perspective concerning sex and sexual orientation. We see this playing out vividly when a police officer must confront a person of color. The cop is always wrong, and the perpetrator is always right, regardless of his previous actions or prior criminal record. The moral compass isn't broken. Actually, it doesn't exist. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jason Romano with us for a few more minutes, and if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to move on to another topic at the bottom of the hour, but again, this book is entitled The Uniform of Leadership, Lessons on True Success from My ESPN Life. And first of all, I might just mention that the book is one that is set up, Jason, for any kind of discussion. We have a number of people that listen to this program that are in leadership positions already. They are pastors, they're Sunday school leaders, Bible fellowship leaders, small group leaders. At the end of the 18 chapters that you usually have about 4 points, kind of bullet points of discussion, and those are available so that if somebody said, you know, I'd really like to kind of talk about this issue of leadership, I want to talk about this maybe with kids that love sports, maybe they already run a fellowship of Christian athletes or some kind of sports outreach, this would be just ideal to hear from somebody that worked at ESPN and along the way really help them to get their priorities straight and recognize that they need to play for the uniform name on the front, not the back. So that is certainly available. But also, I've clicked on the button on your website, which we've made available for individuals for speaking. And when we talked to you back a number of months ago, I recognized at that time the chances of you going and speaking to a fellowship of Christian athletes, a church or a conference or something like that were kind of slim and none. But now I think that is a possibility, and there's a video for people to watch that kind of gives them a little bit of an idea on that. So talk about what would be available based upon your book, the discussions, and even speaking that might be something that our listeners might want to take advantage of.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. It's been a neat thing to watch, especially since I left ESPN. The doors that have opened to be able to speak and kind of travel across the country pre-pandemic, we'll say. And, of course, the pandemic hits, and, anybody who does any kind of speaking or traveling, everybody was kind of shut down in that area. And I was fortunate to be able to join that Zoom that everybody's had to join and be able to kind of still connect with different people. But now that some of these areas across the country are opening up, in fact, I was able to speak at an FCA event in my hometown of New York in Albany last week. And that's what's really been neat about this book is being able to kind of share, go through the discussion questions, for a group like a men's group or, even a church or a high school, wherever it might be, any kind of, college setting. This book is not just written for Christians, although if you are a Christian, it will probably resonate a little bit more. But it's really a book to go through with a team. If you're a manager in an office, you could get this book and go through it with, some of the people that you work with to just learn how to be a better leader. And maybe it sparks something inside of you that maybe challenges you in a way that you weren't thinking about before. Maybe you are playing for that name on the back a little bit more than you'd like. And so that's been a really neat thing to watch. And, yeah, being able to kind of go and share, at different conferences in the past and being able to speak at men's groups and, churches, like I said. I've gone to colleges and been able to kind of give some talks there, especially to teams in schools, to athletes. Having that ESPN connection, I think, is nice to be able to kind of start the questions off with, some sports and have some fun that way. So I've been blessed, and I'm thankful for any opportunities, honestly, because it's not something I'm necessarily seeking or pursuing, but God continues to open up doors, and, I want to walk through those and be as obedient as I can.
Let's, if we can, give people just a sample of some of that. And last time we had you on, we were talking about Drew Brees, and you've had a chance to meet some of these sports figures. Of course, there's a picture of you and Darryl Strawberry and a number of others that are just outstanding individuals. But I love the story about Drew Brees, because here is a guy that is still playing and in some respects has to stay really in shape, and yet you actually were able to work with him and actually began to see his level of humility and what a gracious individual he was. So you might share that, because it's a good example of the kind of thing I know you would share when you speak to an audience about some of these issues.
Absolutely. I love the Drew Brees story, and when we decided to write the book, I was thankful that we were able to include it, because that was one of those crazy days that you work at ESPN. In fact, for me, it was the longest day I ever worked at ESPN. I came in at 8 in the morning to spend 8 hours with Drew Brees, and then went right back to my desk and spent another 8 hours working on the LeBron James free agency story that was going on that day as well. So that was quite the crazy day. But listen, Drew Brees at that point was a Super Bowl MVP. He had just won his first Super Bowl. He was in the prime of his career, and he's coming to ESPN, much like Coach Dungy in the story I told you a little earlier. And Drew is coming. It's just him and his assistant and Todd, his publicist. And, I got a very unique request from Drew's people when he was coming. They said, listen, we know that he's going to be doing a bunch of interviews, and that's what the schedule would look like. But Drew would like to take about an hour and a half, 2 hours in the middle of the day to work out. Now, that might not sound so odd to those listening right now, because he's an athlete, he's a football player. Well, that makes sense. Well, most people who come to ESPN don't request time to work out. They usually just work out around the scheduled, and then when they come to ESPN, they're focused right there. But Drew had his plan. He knew that middle of the day, that's when he needed to get his workout in. And I saw this man, go to the gym, then come outside and throw footballs in front of our cafeteria with his assistant, with his agent, and go through about 20 minutes of real intense workout throwing the football. And this was 2 weeks, Kerby, 2 weeks before training camp started. And it's the middle of July. And I remember telling Drew Brees this. I said, Drew, why are you doing this right now? Why don't you just take a day and enjoy your summer, because training camp's starting in 2 weeks? You just won a Super Bowl. Nobody's going to fault you if you took a day off. And he said, Jason, two things. Number one, this is how I honor God, by continuing to work in an excellent fashion, like it says in Colossians, to do all that you do for the glory of God. So I'm honoring God in the way that I'm working here. But number two, I have a team that's depending on me. So if I take a day off, that might take a chance. That might be one day that I'm missing that could help my team be better this year. And, Drew Brees is one of the all-time great NFL players, but when you hear that coming out of the mouth and then you see it from this Hall of Fame player, you understand what separates him from, pretty much any other quarterback other than maybe the Tom Brady's and the Joe Montanas of the world, is that mindset to not only be great to serve his teammates, but also to honor God in the way that he was working out that day. And I'll never forget that day, because that was such a great lesson for me to witness and to be able to share with others now is so cool, because now you see 10 years later, he leads the NFL all time in passing yards and touchdowns, and he's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And 10 years ago, right after he had won a Super Bowl, he was doing the exact same thing that he's doing now. It was pretty cool.
And also, I think if I remember right, he also said, there's another quarterback that wants my job, so I need to keep working on that as well.
Yeah, I thought that was so funny. Like, Drew Brees, there's nobody chasing your job, Drew, but he said that. He said, listen, I don't know if my job is secure. And I'm thinking, amazing? What are you talking about? You're Drew Brees. But he said, there's two guys behind me that want my job. And so if I'm not working out today, that might be another day that they are, and, I want to keep my job. And I thought, what a mentality, not only to serve his teammates, but to also continue to understand that there are people chasing after what he wants, and it's a privilege and an honor to be where he was, but not to take that for granted.
Again, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, it is certainly available in your local bookstore. It's published by our good friends at Kriegel Publications, so you might be able to find it there. But also, we've made it very easy for you to get a copy of it by going to Jason's website. Of course, we have information about it as well for both hardback and Kindle. And if people go there, they can contact you and interact with you and maybe even schedule you for a speaking engagement. So, Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again, and I hope that generate some opportunities for you in the future, because I know that the lessons you have in your book need to be passed on to the next generation. So thank you for your diligence and wanting to do that.
Kerby, thanks so much for having me again. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful talking with you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics. As I warned you at the beginning, we're going to be doing almost a different topic every half hour, and that is we're going to have Susan Michael with us. She has been the individual that helped develop the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. We're going to talk about what is the significance of this peace accord. She argues that it really is kind of a deadly blow to some of these anti-Semitic campaigns, and as we are starting to try to understand what it means to have this kind of peace accord between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and maybe even in the future with other countries, what is the significance of that? And we'll also spend a little bit of time helping you understand about the Christian embassy there in Jerusalem. So this is just a great opportunity to learn more from her. And, of course, one of the articles we've posted is a piece that appeared in Charisma about this particular issue. And also we've posted one more, Nobel Peace Prize being nominated to President Donald Trump. So we'll get into some of those issues and give you a chance, if you'd like to, in this last half hour to express your opinion. Maybe you have some questions about Israel, about anti-Semitism, about the peace accord, even about the election. We'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to talk about Israel. We're going to talk about the Abraham Accords and a number of other issues that are front and center. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We first of all have a link to this very important organization called the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. And we have a link to that on our website. We also have a blog by the guest that we're going to be talking about that gets into preparing to tabernacle with God, the Feast of Tabernacles, all also one that came out back in August, What the Abraham Accords Mean for Israel. We've also posted an article that came from Charisma in which they were quoting from Susan Michael about how the Israel United Arab Emirates peace accords are a deadly blow to anti-Semitic campaigns. And again, those of you that don't already have this, we have a booklet that I've put together on a biblical view on anti-Semitism. Susan Michaels has been more than 35 years pioneering the development of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem and currently serves as the ministry's USA Director and a member of the Board of Directors. So, Susan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you. It's really great to be with you today.
Talk about this organization, because I think this may be the first time we've actually talked about, on Point of View, the International Christian Embassy. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, it's a very unique organization with a very unique history, headquartered there in Jerusalem. We were founded in 1980 at the time that the Israeli government passed a bill declaring Jerusalem to be the eternal and undivided capital. And there was tremendous international uproar against that. The Arab countries threatened oil embargoes on any country that recognized Jerusalem. So all of the embassies that were in the city literally packed up and moved out in protest. And there was a group of Christians there that were organizing the very first Christian celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. They had about 1,000 Christians there from, 15 countries. And they seized the opportunity and they said, we do not support what our governments have done. And therefore, we're starting an international Christian embassy in Jerusalem that represents the millions of Bible-believing Christians around the world that understand the significance of Jerusalem and stand with Israel. So that's how we got started. It's a very unique starting and unique role there that we've been playing for 40 years now. So we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. But we have really two aspects to our ministry, and one is to be there in Israel, representing the global church in support of Israel. And then secondly is out in the nations where we do a lot of education and speaking in churches and just providing educational resources about Israel, about the biblical significance of Israel. And so that in a nutshell is what we do, but it's a very unique ministry.
Let me pursue, just since you mentioned in passing the idea of the tabernacles, the Feast of the Tabernacles. You have a whole section on holidays and traditions. I've been in Israel when they've actually had the Feast of Tabernacles, and they build those rather rustic situations around the city. But talk about that significance, since that's actually something you just posted a few days ago.
Well, yes, it's at the heart of our ministry. We were born out of celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. So, and the reason is because in the late 70s, there were a group of Christians living there in Jerusalem, and they prayed together regularly, and they had two burdens on their heart. And one was the need to start a ministry in support of Israel, because none existed then. But secondly was the need to bring an awareness to the global church about the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, why? That's because the Feast of Tabernacles is one of the three feasts of Israel in the Bible, and the Christian church knew all about the other two feasts. The first one is Passover, which has Christian fulfillment in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The second one is Shavuot, or Pentecost, which has a Christian fulfillment and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. But the Feast of Tabernacles is still forward-looking. It's still to be fulfilled. It's a prophetic feast. And the prophet Zechariah actually prophesied that one day the Gentiles, the nations, would come up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we felt we needed to begin to bring an awareness of this to the church. And now 40 years later, lots of churches teach about the Feast of Tabernacles, and they may even have their own little celebration of it. And every year we draw 5,000-6,000 Christians from all over the world to Jerusalem for a week-long celebration of it. Now, biblically, what is the Feast of Tabernacles about? It's both looking back and looking forward. So it's to commemorate God's protection and covering over the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. And that's why they build those little flimsy booths that you were describing.
That's right.
It's to remember that, and they're supposed to even be able to see through the roof of it to the sky above as a reminder that God is above them and was their protector and their provider in the wilderness. But once they entered the Holy Land, then God's provision came in the form of rain. So it became a harvest feast where they celebrated the annual harvest, and they prayed for rain for the next year because they would need it for the next harvest. But prophetically, from the very beginning, there was always an element of interceding for the nations during the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's an expression of God's heart that all the nations would be a part of his kingdom and would be worshiping him and celebrating in Jerusalem. And that's why the prophet Zechariah actually predicted that one day they will. So we are not a fulfillment of Zechariah. We're just practicing for it and preparing the nations and the churches around the world for it.
Susan Michael with us, and again with the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. Let's talk about, if you will, the Abraham Accords. That is one of the articles that is on your blog, and we have a link to it on the website. But also I posted this one article in which you also point out that this peace accord is a deadly blow to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is unfortunately increasing around the world, but what is the relationship then between the so-called Abraham Accords, or the peace accord between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, to this issue of anti-Semitism?
Well, I'll tell you, I was recently interviewed by another radio program that I won't name, and it ended up, I was questioned by someone who was very anti-Semitic and began throwing out all of these accusations against Israel that they're committing genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And why on earth would an Arab country like the United Arab Emirates sign a peace accord with Israel if they were really carrying out genocide against Arab peoples? It's a deadly blow to the lies that Israel is doing these terrible things to the Palestinians. It shows that it's not true. It's been a lot of propaganda. It's been anti-Semitic propaganda. And these Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have been courageous enough to come forward and say, it's not true, and we're signing a peace agreement, and we're normalizing relations with Israel, the Jewish state. So it's proving what's true and what's not.
One of the questions I want to maybe get to after the break, but since we're coming up to a break, we'll set that up for afterwards. The relationship, of course, between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the whole significance of this accord, because I think it's going to not only provide diplomatic benefits, but economic benefits, and just even this idea that Donald Trump, as the president, did some things that were very radical from most people's point of view, even in America, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as well as actually pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, the decision to take out one of the chief terrorist generals, if you will, of Iran. And if that's not enough, then even recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So wanted to maybe get your comments about that, because after all, we are in an election year. And you can be as political or non-political as you would like, but I wanted to at least address that. And also just again to talk about the significance of this. As we said just the other day when I was reading a piece from one of these major newspapers, if this had been done by a previous administration, there would be headlines, there would be interviews with individuals asking how did this take place, what were some of the steps that led to this economic and diplomatic breakthrough, and all of that has happened since 1948. So if you've figured out there's 72 years there, okay, Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, Andrew Sadat, okay, I give you credit for that one. This is one of those on that level, but you wouldn't know it by watching the mainstream press. But we'll talk about it here on Point of View, and we'll continue that conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Susan Markle with us for just a few more minutes, the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. One of the things that is so striking to me, Susan, is that if you go to, for example, a Trump rally, even before this election, and you would ask people, what do you like about Donald Trump, don't like about it? It's amazing how many times people will say, he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now, to be honest, you go back and look at his campaign, it wasn't in the top 10, maybe even not in the top 20 issues, but I think it just resonated so much with the American people because they had seen, for example, Bill Clinton say that they were going to move the embassy and did not. They saw George W. Bush say they were going to move the embassy and they did not. They saw that Barack Obama said that they would move the embassy and they did not. They saw candidate Donald Trump say they would move the embassy and they did. And so last time I was in Jerusalem, I got my picture in front of the embassy because it's pretty significant. But you add that to Golan Heights and a variety of other issues, and now even pulling together this peace accord. This is pretty significant, and whether you like this president or not, those were very substantial and significant changes, and Benjamin Netanyahu certainly seems to appreciate that. But you are on the ground. Tell us what is actually being perceived because of some of those actions.
Well, there's no doubt about it, but President Trump has been the most pro-Israel president ever. And what he's done to support Israel and the moving of the U.S. Embassy in spite of extreme pressure against it. He had phone calls from all over the world. His own advisors were telling him not to. It would produce violence. And, of course, there was no violence whatsoever. There was no reaction. And so, it was a major move, and we have appreciated so much. And, of course, he knows that support of Israel and moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was a very key issue for the evangelical vote in America. And we actually conveyed that to his campaign before he was elected. He knew it was one of the top 5 issues for us regarding Israel. And so he stuck to his promises. He did promise it when he was campaigning, and unlike the others, he fulfilled his promise. And that's been a driving force in his administration. He believes very strongly in fulfilling his promises to the American people. And if he said he was going to do something, he's doing everything that he can to fulfill those promises. But, there's such pushback against him, and this is why I appreciate what you're doing in bringing this news, even of the Abraham Accord, to your audience, because it is a major accomplishment. And the media has been very quiet about it. They tried to play it down as much as they could. They tried to ignore it as much as they could because they knew that this made President Trump look good, and it made Prime Minister Netanyahu look good. And so they didn't even talk about it. But yet this is nothing short of a realignment of the entire Middle East. And it's a major step forward for peace in the Middle East and for peace for Israel in the Middle East. And so we're very, very thankful for Trump and what he did to make this happen.
Let's talk about how people can join with you. If we go again to the website, we have a link to your website, but at the very bottom there, you talk about a couple things. First of all, pray. To join the Isaiah 62 prayer initiative, I want you to describe that, to join, and then to give. So talk about how people can join with you, both in prayer and involvement and even in giving.
Yes, well, and I'd like to add a third option to that. This weekend, we're beginning our Feast of Tabernacles celebration.
Yes.
It is all online. So we invite everyone to go to icej.live and find out more about that. It's going to be an amazing event. Secondly, we do have our Isaiah 62 prayer initiative. Every month, we send out prayer points from Jerusalem. They go out all around the world. And Christians and churches all around the world are praying in agreement that month for these things for Israel, prayer points for the Arab world and the Middle East, and prayer points for our ministry and with the Jewish people. So we invite people on our website. They can find it. I believe the URL would be icejusa.org/Isaiah 62, but they can find it on our website. And third, yes, we invite them to donate, to be a blessing to Israel financially. And once again, icejusa.org. They can find a donate button right there, center forward. So
and that is
you.
a more difficult website to find, which is one of the reasons why we certainly encourage you. Just simply go to our website, pointofview.net,
Yes.
click on the picture of Susan Michael, and then you'll find it there. But let's again talk about the blog, because that's the link that we have right now. Can people subscribe to that blog? And are there various videos they can watch? And are there some ways that they can pass this on to their friends and neighbors?
Yes, we really invite them to take advantage of that blog. There's probably, I don't know how many articles in there on all kinds of subjects, biblical as well as current events. And so if they sign up for our email list, any of the sign-up buttons, they will begin to hear from me and be aware of any articles that I put out. We're also launching a new podcast and video channel on YouTube that'll be up October 13th. So if they will go to your website and click on that and then sign up for our emails, they'll be aware of all this new content that will be coming out.
I might just mention, too, just in passing, since, of course, you're going to be doing a lot of things online. You've posted in the past why pandemics are dangerous for Jewish people, the Passover and the coronavirus. Of course, now we have the Feast of Tabernacles and coronavirus. This has just been a very difficult time for what you're doing there in Israel, and really has been, if you will, somewhat dangerous time for Jewish people, hasn't it?
Well, it is because any pandemic is given over to a lot of conspiracy theories. People get fearful, and then they become angry, and they look for somebody to blame. And we've seen a lot of that under the coronavirus here in the United States. Unfortunately, there have been theories then passed about by some of the anti-Semites pointing the finger at Jews in general or Israelis. They were behind it. They were going to make money off of it. So that's why we want to highlight to be aware of these conspiracy theories. They're very dangerous for the Jewish people. Yeah. And but yes, it's been a difficult year. And in Israel, we've been very busy bringing aid to Holocaust survivors and the elderly that were shut in their homes. And we've actually been busier than ever. And just demonstrating Christian love and support to the people in Israel. And they've been so grateful for it.
Well, Susan, thank you so very much for educating us, and appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, it's been great. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Again, we have one link that you can follow, and that will take you to the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, and that is available on our website. Also posted this article on how this Abraham Accord, or the Israel-UAE Peace Accord, whatever you want to call it, actually is somewhat of a deadly blow to these anti-Semitic campaigns. And so I thought you would appreciate that particular article there as well. We are convinced that these are important issues for you to know about. We certainly encourage you to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and also take the time to find out a little bit more. We have links so that you can pray for Israel, that you can pray for this International Christian Embassy, and also where you can join up with them and even financially support them if you want to do so. So again, these are the things that we always provide here at Point of View. And as you go to the website, pointofview.net, you'll find everything that you need to get involved. And you've been listening to Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.